My name is Natalie Brennan, and I'm 28 years old. 12 years ago, on a freezing night in November, my parents threw me out of the only home I'd ever known because my older sister Caitlin told them I'd stolen $800 from her bedroom. I didn't take a single cent. But that didn't matter. Their golden child had spoken, and the verdict was instant. Here's what none of them knew. 12 years later, at a Thanksgiving dinner I wasn't even supposed to attend, Caitlin would stand up in front of 23 members of our extended family, a glass of wine trembling in her hand, and say the 7 words that would shatter every lie she'd ever told. And when she did, the look on my mother's face, that slow draining of color, the fork slipping from her fingers, the absolute silence that swallowed the room. That was the moment I realized something I'd spent over a decade trying to understand. The truth doesn't expire. It just waits. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Trust me, you're going to want to stay for the whole thing. Let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Ridgewood, New Jersey, in a colonial-style house with green shutters and a wraparound porch that my mother kept immaculate because she believed a home's exterior told the world everything it needed to know about the family inside. She wasn't wrong about that. She just didn't realize that what our house actually told the world was a lie. My sister Caitlin was 3 years older than me. She was born with the kind of effortless beauty that people comment on before they even ask your name. Blonde hair that curled without effort, wide green eyes, a smile that could make teachers forgive late homework. She was the kind of daughter my mother had always imagined having, and she never let me forget that I was the other one. I was quieter, darker hair, darker eyes, more serious. I preferred books to parties. I would rather sit in the corner of my father's study reading his old legal thrillers than stand in a crowd and perform. My mother saw this as defiance. My father saw it as disappointment. And Caitlin, well, Caitlin saw it as opportunity. I want you to understand something. The night they kicked me out wasn't the beginning. It was the end of a pattern that had been building for 16 years. A pattern so gradual, so normalized, that I didn't even have the language for it until years later, sitting in a therapist's office in Brooklyn, learning about something called family scapegoating for the first time. Let me give you the scenes that no one in my family would ever admit happened. I was 9 years old. It was my birthday. My mother had promised me a chocolate cake with raspberry filling, the kind we'd seen in a bakery window the month before, and I'd talked about nonstop. That morning, I came downstairs in my birthday dress, the one with the little white flowers that my grandmother had sent in the mail. The kitchen smelled like vanilla, and for one beautiful second, I thought everything was perfect. Then Caitlin came downstairs, and she was crying. She said she had a stomach ache. She said she thought she might be getting the flu. And just like that, my birthday shifted. My mother canceled my party to stay home and take care of Caitlin. My dad drove to the pharmacy instead of the bakery. The chocolate cake with raspberry filling never materialized. That night, I ate leftover pasta at the kitchen table, while Caitlin, miraculously recovered by 6 p.m, watched a movie in the living room with both my parents tucked around her on the couch. I didn't cry. I remember that. I didn't cry because I was already learning that my tears didn't carry the same weight as hers. Then there was the science fair. I was 11 and I'd spent 3 weeks building a project on how plants respond to different types of music. I played classical for one set of seedlings, rock for another, and silence for the control group. I documented everything with photographs and hand-drawn charts. My teacher, Mrs. Greenwald, told me it was one of the best projects she'd seen in 20 years of teaching. The night of the science fair, Caitlin had a volleyball game. My parents went to her game. They told me they'd come to the science fair afterward, during the second half of the evening. I stood next to my project for 2 hours, watching other kids' parents take photos, ask questions, beam with pride. My parents never showed. When I got home, my mother said, "Don't be dramatic, Natalie. We said we'd try." Caitlin's game went into overtime. I won second place. I found the ribbon in the trash 3 days later, mixed in with junk mail. I never asked who threw it away. I think I was afraid to hear the answer. At 13, I made the honor roll for the first time, straight A's across the board. I brought the report card home like a trophy, holding it against my chest on the bus ride, imagining the look on my father's face. When I showed him, he glanced at it, nodded, and said, "Good. Keep it up." Then he turned back to Caitlin's college prep brochures spread across the dining room table. She was only 16, but they were already planning her future. Princeton, maybe Columbia. They talked about it like it was inevitable, like the sky deciding to be blue. Nobody put my report card on the fridge. I did it myself the next morning, with a magnet shaped like a ladybug. When I came home from school, it was gone, replaced by a flyer for Caitlin's upcoming dance recital. I know what you're thinking. These are small things. Kids have it worse. And you're right, they do. But here's what I've learned since then. Neglect doesn't always look like bruises. Sometimes it looks like an empty chair at a science fair. Sometimes it looks like a report card in a kitchen drawer. Sometimes it's so quiet you can convince yourself it isn't happening at all, because the people doing it smile at you over breakfast and say, "I love you," when they tuck you in at night. The thing about being the family scapegoat is that you don't know you're the scapegoat. You just think you're the problem. You think if you were smarter, prettier, louder, quieter, more like Caitlin, less like yourself, they would see you. So you keep shrinking. You keep folding yourself into smaller and smaller shapes, trying to fit into a space that was never designed for you. And then one night, you stop fitting altogether. November 14th. I was 16 years old. It was a Tuesday, and I remember that because I had a history test the next day, and I was sitting on my bedroom floor with my textbook open to the chapter on the French Revolution, highlighting passages about the Reign of Terror. The irony of that wouldn't hit me until years later. At 8:47 in the evening, my bedroom door flew open. My mother was standing there, and her face was something I'd never seen before. Not angry exactly. Angry was familiar. This was something colder, resolved, like she'd already made a decision and was just delivering the verdict. "Where is it?" she said. I looked up from my textbook. Where is what? Caitlin's money. The $800 she's been saving from her job at the bookstore. It was in her top dresser drawer, and now it's gone. Where is it? I felt my stomach drop. Not because I was guilty, but because I recognized the machinery clicking into place. The accusation wasn't a question. It was a sentence. I didn't take Caitlin's money, I said. I haven't been in her room. My mother crossed her arms. She says you were in there yesterday afternoon when she came home from practice. I was returning her hair straightener. She left it in the bathroom, and I put it back on her desk. That's it. So you were in her room. For 30 seconds, to return her stuff. Mom, I didn't take anything. My father appeared behind her in the doorway. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, arms at his sides, face slack. That silence, his silence, was the loudest thing in the room. My mother said, Caitlin is devastated. She worked for months to save that money. If you give it back right now, we can discuss this like a family. I don't have it. I never had it. I didn't take it. And then Caitlin appeared. She slid past my father like a shadow. Her eyes were red, her mascara streaked, and she looked at me with this expression that I've replayed 1,000 times in my memory. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was performance. I didn't have the word for it then, but I do now. She was performing. I just want my money back, Natalie, she said, her voice trembling perfectly. I'm not even mad. I just need it. I didn't take your money, Caitlin. She turned to my mother and started crying, not sniffling, full body-shaking sobs. And my mother wrapped her arms around her and glared at me over Caitlin's shoulder like I was a stranger who had broken into our house. My father finally spoke. 5 words. Maybe you should leave, Natalie. I remember the texture of the carpet under my knees. I remember the yellow circle of light from my desk lamp. I remember the smell of the lavender diffuser my mother had given me for Christmas, the one nice thing she'd ever picked out specifically for me. And I remember thinking with absolute clarity that nothing I said would matter, because the story had already been written. I was the thief, Caitlin was the victim, and my parents had already chosen a side. They gave me 45 minutes to pack a bag. 45 minutes. My mother stood in the hallway timing me. My father sat downstairs in his armchair, staring at the television, which wasn't even turned on. Caitlin was in her room with the door closed, and through the wall, I could hear her talking on the phone. Laughing. Actually, laughing. I walked out of that house with a duffel bag, $63 in birthday money, and a phone with 12% battery. The air was so cold it hurt my lungs. The porch light clicked off behind me before I reached the sidewalk. I was 16 years old, standing in the dark in suburban New Jersey, and I had nowhere to go. That first night, I walked for 2 hours. I walked through our neighborhood, past the houses where families were eating dinner and watching television and arguing about homework. All the ordinary things that I would have given anything to have back. I ended up at the 24-hour laundromat on Ridge Avenue, sitting on a plastic chair next to a woman folding towels who didn't ask me any questions, which was the kindest thing anyone could have done. I slept on a bench at the bus station that night. The metal slats left red lines on my arms. A police officer woke me up at 5 a.m. and asked if I had somewhere to be. I told him I was waiting for a friend. He looked at me for a long time, and I think he knew I was lying, but he just nodded and walked away. For the next 2 weeks, I bounced. A friend's couch for 3 nights until her parents found out and called my mother, who told them I'd been acting out and they shouldn't get involved. Another friend's basement for 4 nights, a shelter in Hackensack for 6 days, where they gave me a cot and a wool blanket, and a social worker named Diana, who looked at me with such tenderness that I almost fell apart. Diana was the first person who asked me what had happened from my side. She sat with me in a room with fluorescent lights and a table with one wobbly leg, and she said, "Tell me your version, Natalie." And I did. And when I was done, she said something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. She said, "I believe you." 3 words. That's all it took to crack the wall I'd been building since I was 9 years old. Diana connected me with a program for displaced youth in Bergen County. They helped me finish high school through an alternative program. I got my GED at 17. I worked 2 jobs, one at a diner called Mama Rose's and one at a dry cleaner's, where the owner, Mr. Petrov, a Ukrainian immigrant with enormous hands and a gentle voice, let me do my homework behind the counter when business was slow. I want to pause here for a second. If you've ever been the one your family chose not to believe, the one they found easier to discard than to listen to, I see you. I really do. Type "I see you too" in the comments if that resonates. And if this story is hitting close to home, please hit that like button so more people who need to hear this can find it. Here's what nobody tells you about being cast out of your own family at 16. There's a period, and it lasts longer than you think, where you believe you deserved it. Not intellectually. Intellectually, you know you didn't steal anything. But emotionally, somewhere in the basement of your psyche, you think, maybe I am the kind of person who takes things. Maybe I am the kind of person who deserves to be left on a cold sidewalk with a duffel bag and 12% battery. Because if your own parents can look at you and decide you're disposable, then maybe you are. It took me 3 years to stop believing that. 3 years, 2 therapists, and one extraordinary woman named Gloria Chen. I met Gloria on a Tuesday afternoon in March when I was 19. I was waitressing at a restaurant in Montclair, a nicer place than the diner, where I'd worked my way up to serving the dinner shift. She came in alone, ordered the salmon, and asked me if I'd ever considered going to college. I almost laughed. "I can barely afford rent," I said. Gloria looked at me with these sharp, knowing eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses and said, "That wasn't what I asked. I asked if you'd considered it." I found out later that Gloria was a retired professor of social work from Rutgers University. She'd spent 30 years studying family systems and the long-term effects of parental rejection on adolescents. She'd published papers and books. She'd testified before state legislatures about funding for youth shelters. She was, in the most literal sense, an expert on exactly what had happened to me. But in that moment, she was just a woman eating salmon, asking a waitress about her dreams. Something made me honest with her. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, not through me, not past me, but directly at me, with a focus that felt like sunlight after a long winter. I told her I'd always wanted to study psychology, that I'd been fascinated by why people do what they do, why families break the way they break, why some people get chosen and others get discarded. Gloria set down her fork and said, "Come to my house for dinner on Sunday. I'm a terrible cook, but my wife makes exceptional lasagna, and I want to hear more." I almost said no. I almost walked away, because by that point, kindness from strangers felt like a trap. Every time someone had been kind to me before, there was a catch. But something about Gloria felt different. She wasn't offering to save me. She was offering to see me. There's a difference. That Sunday dinner changed my life. Gloria and her wife Margaret lived in a craftsman house in Maplewood with a garden in the back and bookshelves in every room. Their living room smelled like old pages and fresh coffee. They had a cat named Dostoevsky who slept on the radiator and a dog named Biscuit who followed Gloria everywhere like a furry shadow. Margaret's lasagna was, in fact, exceptional. 3 kinds of cheese, homemade sauce, garlic bread on the side that crackled when you bit into it. I ate until I was uncomfortably full because I hadn't had a home-cooked meal in almost 3 years, and my body didn't know when to stop. After dinner, Gloria and I sat on the back porch while Margaret did the dishes, which she insisted on doing alone because she said it was her thinking time. Gloria asked me about my family, and I told her everything. The birthdays, the science fair, the report card, the night they kicked me out, Caitlin's performance, my father's silence. When I finished, Gloria was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Natalie, you were the identified patient in a dysfunctional family system. That's a clinical term for the person the family unconsciously selects to carry all of its unresolved pain. You weren't the problem. You were the mirror they couldn't face." I had never heard it put that way before. The identified patient, the mirror they couldn't face. Something inside me rearranged itself, not fixed, not healed, but shifted, like a bone being set after years of growing in the wrong direction. Sunday dinners at Gloria and Margaret's became a ritual. Every week, without exception. They never canceled, they never forgot. If I was working a double shift, Gloria would pack a plate and leave it on my doorstep with a note that always said the same thing. You were missed. You were missed. 3 words that rebuilt me from the inside. Gloria helped me apply to community college. She wrote my recommendation letter herself, and when I asked her what she'd said, she told me, "I wrote the truth, that you're the most resilient person I've ever met, and that any institution would be lucky to have you." I cried in the parking lot for 20 minutes after she told me that. I got in. Full scholarship through a program for non-traditional students. I studied psychology, because of course I did. I graduated in 2 years with a 4.0 GPA. Then I transferred to Rutgers, Gloria's old stomping ground, on another scholarship, and I finished my bachelor's degree in 3 years. During that time, I heard nothing from my family. Nothing. No calls, no texts, no letters. Holidays came and went like weather, just something that happened to other people. Thanksgiving was the worst. I'd walk through the grocery store and see the turkeys and the cranberry sauce and the pie crusts, and I'd feel this physical pain in my chest, like someone had reached inside me and squeezed. I spent my first Thanksgiving after being kicked out at the shelter where Diana worked. She saved me a plate. I spent my second Thanksgiving at Mama Rose's diner, serving other people's families their holiday meals and smiling so hard my face ached. I spent my third Thanksgiving at Gloria and Margaret's, and that was the first time in years that the holiday felt like something other than a wound. By my 4th year at Rutgers, I was excelling. I'd been accepted into a master's program in clinical psychology. I was working as a research assistant for a professor studying the long-term impacts of family estrangement on adult mental health. I was building something, not just a career, but a self. A person I could recognize in the mirror and not flinch. And then my mother called. It was a Thursday evening in October. I was in my apartment, a tiny studio in New Brunswick, with a window that overlooked a parking lot, eating leftover Thai food and reading a paper on attachment theory. My phone buzzed with a number I hadn't seen in 6 years, but had never deleted, because some part of me, some stubborn, stupid, hopeful part, had been waiting for it. Natalie? My mother's voice sounded older, smaller. Yes? It's Mom. I didn't say anything. I just listened to her breathe. Your father had a heart attack. He's in the hospital, St. Joseph's. I thought you should know. She didn't say, I miss you. She didn't say, I'm sorry. She didn't say, we were wrong. She said, I thought you should know, like she was a neighbor delivering a piece of forwarded mail. Is he okay? I asked. He's stable. They're keeping him for observation. There was a pause. I could hear the hospital sounds in the background, the beeping, the intercom, shoes on linoleum. Will you come? She asked. I said, I'll think about it, and I hung up. I called Gloria. She answered on the second ring, like she always did, because Gloria Chen was the kind of person who kept her phone on loud in case someone she loved needed her. I told her about the call, about my father, about the way my mother's voice sounded like a door that had been locked for years and was now being pushed open just a crack, just enough to see through, but not enough to walk through. Gloria said, What do you want to do? I don't know. That's okay. You don't have to know right now. But I want you to hear something, Natalie. Whatever you decide, it's not a test. There's no right answer. The only question is, what serves your healing? I didn't go to the hospital. I thought about it for 3 days, and then I decided not to go. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, out of self-preservation. I was 22 years old, and I was finally building a life that wasn't defined by the people who had thrown me away, and I wasn't ready to let them back in. I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready. My mother didn't call again. My father recovered. I know because I checked his name on the hospital's patient portal, anonymously, like a stranger. Like the stranger they'd made me. 2 more years passed. I finished my master's degree. I started a practice as a therapist specializing in family estrangement and trauma. Because the universe has a dark sense of humor, and also because I wanted to be for other people what Diana and Gloria had been for me. I rented office space in a brownstone in Hoboken. I painted the walls a warm yellow and put a plant on the windowsill and hung a framed print that said, You are not too much. You were always enough. I had a life, a real one. Sunday dinners with Gloria and Margaret, friends from graduate school who became my chosen family, a boyfriend named Daniel who was kind and steady and who, the first time I told him about my childhood, held my hand and said, I'm glad you survived them. And then came the Thanksgiving invitation. It arrived in October, 11 years after the night they kicked me out. A physical invitation. Cream-colored cardstock with gold lettering addressed to my office because my family didn't have my home address. It was from my Aunt Patricia, my father's sister, the one family member who had always been quietly kind to me, who had slipped me a $100 bill at my 8th grade graduation and whispered, You're going to be just fine, sweetheart. The invitation was for Thanksgiving dinner at Aunt Patricia's house in Morristown. 23 family members confirmed. And at the bottom, in Aunt Patricia's handwriting, she had added a note. Natalie, I would love for you to be there. You've been missed. Truly. P.S. Your parents and Caitlin will be there. I understand if that changes your answer. I held that invitation for 2 weeks. I put it on my kitchen counter, then in a drawer, then back on the counter, then on my nightstand where I could stare at it while I tried to fall asleep. Daniel told me he'd support whatever I decided. Gloria said the same thing she always said: what serves your healing? Before the big reveal, I have a question for you. If you were in my shoes, would you have gone to that Thanksgiving dinner, knowing your parents would be there, knowing your sister would be there, knowing that no one had apologized, no one had reached out, no one had tried to make it right in 11 years? Would you have walked through that door? Type yes or no in the comments. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because what happened next is something I still can barely believe. I went. I wore a navy blue dress that I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and a pair of earrings that Gloria had given me for my 27th birthday. Small gold hoops that caught the light when I turned my head. Daniel drove. He held my hand the entire way, and when we pulled into Aunt Patricia's driveway, he looked at me and said, "Whatever happens in there, we go home together." Aunt Patricia's house was glowing. Every window lit up, the kind of warm, golden light that spills onto the lawn and makes a house look like something from a greeting card. I could see people moving inside, shadows behind curtains, and I could smell the turkey from the driveway. It hit me so hard, I nearly turned around. That smell was every Thanksgiving I'd missed, every empty chair, every plate I'd eaten alone. Aunt Patricia opened the door before I knocked. She looked older, her hair silver now where it used to be auburn, but her eyes were the same, warm, real. She pulled me into a hug so tight I felt my ribs compress, and she whispered, "Thank you for coming." The house was full. Cousins I hadn't seen since childhood, uncles and aunts, children I'd never met, the next generation, running through the hallway in their socks. And there, in the living room, standing near the fireplace with a glass of white wine, was my mother. She looked like she'd aged 20 years, not 11. Her hair was thinner, her posture smaller, and when she saw me, her face did something complicated. Surprise, then fear, then something that might have been hope, all cycling through in about 3 seconds. She didn't move. She didn't come toward me. She just stood there, holding her wine glass, watching me like I was a ghost who had walked through the wall. My father was sitting in an armchair near the window. He was thinner than I remembered, the heart attack having hollowed him out. He looked at me and his lower lip trembled, just once, and then he looked down at his hands. And then there was Caitlin. She was across the room, leaning against the dining room doorway, and she looked exactly the way I remembered, except something was different, something around the eyes. She looked tired, not the performative exhaustion she used to deploy to get attention. Real tired. The kind that comes from carrying something heavy for a very long time. For the first 2 hours, we existed in the same space without directly interacting. The family orbited around us like we were celestial bodies with incompatible gravitational fields. Aunt Patricia kept the conversation moving, kept the wine flowing, kept the cousins' children entertained with board games in the den. She was managing the room, and she was doing it brilliantly. Dinner was served at 4 p.m. 23 people around a table that had been extended with 2 card tables and covered with matching tablecloths to hide the seams. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, 3 kinds of pie. The smells layered over each other like music, and for a moment, I was 9 years old again, standing in a kitchen, waiting for a chocolate cake that would never arrive. Aunt Patricia asked my cousin Thomas to say grace. He did, thanking God for family, for health, for the people around the table, and then he added, and for the people who found their way back to us. He looked at me when he said it. We ate, people talked, laughter moved around the table like a warm current. Daniel fit in immediately, charming my aunts with questions about their gardens and making my uncle laugh with a story about his first attempt at cooking Thanksgiving dinner, which involved a smoke detector and a panicked call to his mother. I was starting to relax. I was starting to think, maybe I could do this. Maybe I could sit at a table with the people who had thrown me away and survive it, not because they'd changed, but because I had. And then Caitlin stood up. She stood up mid-conversation in the middle of a lull between courses, and she picked up her wine glass and she tapped it with a fork. The room went quiet in stages, conversations dying like candles being snuffed out one by one. 23 faces turned toward her. I need to say something, Caitlin said. Her voice was steady, but her hand wasn't. The wine was trembling in the glass, little concentric circles rippling outward. My mother said, Caitlin, sit down. This isn't the time. It's exactly the time, Caitlin said, and something in her voice made my mother close her mouth. Caitlin looked at me, directly at me, across the table, past the turkey carcass and the half-empty bowls and the scattered napkins. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you're about to hand them something you've been carrying for too long. Natalie, she said, I need to tell you something. I need to tell everyone something. The room was so quiet I could hear the furnace clicking on in the basement. 12 years ago, I told Mom and Dad that you stole $800 from my room. That was a lie. You never took anything from me. The money wasn't stolen. I spent it. I spent it on things I didn't want them to know about. Clothes I'd hidden, concert tickets, things I'd bought for a boyfriend they didn't know I had. And when they noticed the money was gone, I panicked and I blamed you because I knew they'd believe me, because they always believed me. She paused. The wine glass was shaking badly now, and she set it down on the table with a small click. I knew what would happen when I told them. I knew they'd take my side. I knew they might punish you, but I didn't think they'd actually kick you out. I thought they'd ground you, take your phone, something temporary. When Dad told you to leave, I was in my room, and I heard the front door close, and I thought you'd be back in the morning. I thought Mom would cool down and bring you home. She stopped. Her face was breaking, the composure crumbling like wet sand. You didn't come back, and I didn't say anything. Not the next day, not the next week, not the next year. I told myself it wasn't my fault, that Mom and Dad overreacted, that you chose to stay away. I told myself every lie I could invent to avoid the truth, which is that I destroyed my sister's life to protect myself from getting grounded. The silence in that room was something physical. It had weight. It pressed against the walls and the ceiling and the faces of every person at that table. I looked at my mother. Her face was white, not pink, not flushed, white. The blood had left her face entirely, and she was gripping the edge of the table with both hands like the room was tilting. My father was crying. Not the composed, single-tear crying that men in movies do. Real crying. Shoulders shaking, hand over his mouth. The kind of crying that sounds like it's being pulled out of someone against their will. He was staring at Caitlin, and then he turned and looked at me. And the expression on his face was something I'd never seen there before. Recognition. He was seeing me, maybe for the first time in his life, and what he saw broke him. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the ticking of Aunt Patricia's mantel clock and my father's ragged breathing. I looked at Caitlin and I said, "I know." She blinked. "What?" "I've always known you were lying, Caitlin. I was there. I knew I didn't take it. The question was never whether you lied. The question was whether anyone would care enough to find out." My mother made a sound, a small, strangled sound, like something was caught in her throat. She turned to my father and said, "David," and his name came out like a plea. My father looked at my mother, then he looked at me, and he said the first honest thing I'd heard him say in 12 years. "I was a coward. I've always been a coward. I let your mother make the decisions, and I stood in doorways, and I said nothing. And you paid for every ounce of my silence." The room was dissolving. Cousins were looking at each other. Aunt Patricia had her hand pressed to her chest. Uncle Richard was slowly shaking his head. The children in the den had gone quiet, sensing the shift in pressure the way animals sense a storm. My mother spoke. "Natalie, we didn't know. We believed her. We thought—" I held up my hand, not aggressively, gently, the way you'd stop someone from walking into traffic. "You thought what was convenient," I said. "You thought what you'd always thought, that Caitlin was the one worth believing and I was the one worth discarding. That pattern didn't start with the money. It started with a birthday cake when I was 9. It started with a science fair ribbon in the trash. It started every single time you looked through me to see her." I wasn't angry. I want you to understand that. I wasn't angry anymore. The anger had burned itself out years ago, replaced by something harder and clearer, like glass that's been through a furnace. I was just telling the truth. Finally, after 12 years, someone in this family was telling the truth. Daniel's hand found mine under the table. He squeezed once. "I'm here. I'm not saying this to punish you," I continued. "I'm not saying this to make you feel what I felt. I'm saying this because I spent 12 years building a life without you. I found people who chose me, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I have a career helping people who went through exactly what I went through. I have a family that doesn't share my blood, but shares every single thing that matters. And I need you to know that I didn't survive in spite of what you did to me. I survived because of people who were willing to do what you never could. They saw me. They believed me. They stayed." Aunt Patricia stood up. She walked around the table and stood beside me, and she put her hand on my shoulder, and she said, "I knew. I didn't know about the lie, but I knew something was wrong from the day you disappeared. I called your parents. I called them dozens of times. Your mother told me you'd run away. She told me you were troubled. She told me not to get involved. She turned to my mother. Helen, I love you. You're my brother's wife, and you're the mother of my nieces. But what you did to this child was unforgivable. And the fact that you told all of us that she ran away, that she was the problem, that we should respect your family's privacy, that was its own kind of lie. Uncle Richard spoke from the end of the table. Patricia's right. We all heard the story Helen told. Troubled teenager, acting out, running with a bad crowd. None of us questioned it. We should have. My cousin Sarah, Thomas's wife, was quietly crying. She looked at me and said, I'm so sorry, Natalie. We should have looked for you. The room was cracking open, and all the things that had been sealed inside for 12 years were spilling out. Every assumption, every unchallenged story, every comfortable silence that had allowed my family to erase me from the narrative and keep eating their Thanksgiving turkey and keep putting up their Christmas trees and keep living their lives as if I'd never existed. My mother was crying now, deep, ugly crying, the kind you can't control and can't hide. My father had his face in his hands, and Caitlin was standing at the head of the table, motionless, tears streaming down her face, waiting. Why now? I asked her. Why today? Caitlin swallowed. Because I started therapy 6 months ago. Because my therapist told me that the guilt I've been carrying was going to destroy me if I didn't let it go. Because I saw you walk through that door tonight, and I realized that you turned into someone amazing without us, and we didn't deserve any of it. Because I'm 31 years old, and I've never had a relationship that lasted more than a year, because I can't be honest with anyone. Because lying about you was the first lie I ever told, and it taught me that lying works, and I've been lying ever since, to everyone, about everything. And I'm tired, Natalie. I'm so tired of being the person who ruined her sister's life. I sat with that for a moment. I let the silence hold it. Then I said, You didn't ruin my life, Caitlin. You changed it. I won't pretend the change didn't almost kill me. There were nights I slept on benches. There were weeks I ate 1 meal a day. There was a year where I thought about not being alive anymore because I couldn't understand what was so wrong with me that my own parents could throw me away like garbage. But you didn't ruin me. I wouldn't let you. I stood up. Daniel stood with me, and I looked at my parents, at Caitlin, at the extended family watching this unfold with their mouths open and their hearts breaking. I'm not closing the door, I said, but I'm the one who decides when it opens. And right now, I need to leave. Not because I'm running, because I've spent 12 years learning that I get to choose when I stay and when I go. And right now, I choose to go home. I turned to Aunt Patricia. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being the one person in this family who never stopped caring. She hugged me again. She smelled like cinnamon and turkey and home, a word I'd had to redefine entirely. Daniel and I walked out of that house into the cold November air, the same kind of cold as the night they kicked me out, biting and sharp. But this time I had a coat that fit. I had a car with a full tank of gas. I had a man beside me who loved me. I had somewhere to go. We drove home in silence for the first 20 minutes. Then Daniel said, "Are you okay?" I thought about it. Really thought about it. I think I'm going to be, I said. In the weeks after Thanksgiving, things unfolded the way they do when the truth finally surfaces after being buried for over a decade. Aunt Patricia called me 3 days later to tell me that she'd had a long conversation with my mother and father. She said my mother was in what Patricia called a complete emotional collapse, and that my father had barely spoken since the dinner. She said Caitlin had driven back to her apartment that night and hadn't answered anyone's calls for a week. The extended family reacted. Cousins reached out to me directly, some with apologies, some with stories of their own suspicions that they'd never voiced. My grandmother, my father's mother, who was 91 and living in an assisted care facility in Pennsylvania, called me on a Saturday morning and said in a voice like crumpled tissue paper, "I always knew something wasn't right. I should have fought harder for you. I'm sorry I was too old and too scared." My mother wrote me a letter. It arrived 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, 6 pages, handwritten, on the same cream-colored stationery she used for thank you notes and Christmas cards. I read it at Gloria's kitchen table. Gloria sat across from me and didn't say a word while I read. The letter was not what I expected. It wasn't full of excuses, though there were some. It was full of details. Specific memories that she'd rewritten in her mind to make the narrative work. The science fair. She claimed she hadn't known about the ribbon. The birthday party. She said she truly believed Caitlin was sick. The report card. She said she didn't remember throwing it away. But at the end, she wrote something that I've read probably 50 times. She wrote, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not sure I'd forgive me if I were you. But I want you to know that losing you was the worst thing that's ever happened to me, even though I'm the one who caused it. I just didn't know how to be wrong. I still don't, but I'm learning." I didn't write back, not yet, but I kept the letter. My father called me in January. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. He cried for 6 of them. He told me he'd started seeing a therapist for the first time in his life at 63 years old. He told me he'd been having nightmares about the night he told me to leave. He told me he keeps seeing me standing in the doorway with my duffel bag. And in the dreams, he says what he should have said, which was, "Stay. Tell me what happened. I'll listen." I said, "That's a good dream, Dad." He said, "It's the worst dream I've ever had, because every time I wake up, I remember that I didn't say it." Caitlin emailed me in February. It was short. She said she'd enrolled in a 12-step program for compulsive lying, which I didn't even know existed. She said her therapist had diagnosed her with narcissistic tendencies rooted in the same family dysfunction that had made me the scapegoat. She said she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again, and she would respect that boundary. She said, "You deserved a better sister. I'm trying to become one, but I understand if it's too late." I didn't respond to that either. Not because I was punishing her, because I wasn't ready. And one of the most important things I've learned is that you are never obligated to forgive on someone else's timeline. Apologies expire. Boundaries don't. 6 months after Thanksgiving, I invited my father to meet me for coffee. Just him. No mother, no Caitlin, no mediators. We sat in a diner in Montclair, the same town where I'd met Gloria 7 years earlier, and we had the most honest conversation we'd ever had. He told me about his own childhood, about a father who believed that silence was strength and that emotions were weakness. He told me he'd spent his whole marriage deferring to my mother because conflict terrified him, because his own father had been a man of volcanic rages and David Brennan had vowed to be the opposite, not realizing that the opposite of rage isn't silence, it's courage. And courage was the one thing he'd never had. I looked at my father across that diner table, at this diminished man with his hospital-thin frame and his red-rimmed eyes, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness, not yet, but compassion. I saw him not as the man who'd failed me, but as a man who had been failed by his own father, and who'd passed that failure down like a genetic mutation, a defect in the code of our family. "I can't give you absolution, Dad," I said. "I'm not qualified for that, and I don't think it would help you if I did. But I can tell you that I'm okay. I'm better than okay. And I didn't get there because of you, but I'm willing to let you watch." He nodded. He understood. And for the first time in my life, his silence felt like acceptance instead of abandonment. I'm 28 years old now. I live in a brownstone apartment in Hoboken with Daniel, who proposed to me last spring on the back porch of Gloria and Margaret's house, surrounded by their garden in full bloom, with Biscuit barking like an idiot in the background. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I have a practice that I love, where I sit across from people who were once where I was, broken and bewildered and convinced that being discarded meant they deserved it. And I tell them what Diana told me in that fluorescent room when I was 16. I believe you. I tell them what Gloria showed me over years of Sunday dinners. You are worth choosing. I tell them what I had to teach myself through scraped knees and sleepless nights and a decade of refusing to give up. That your family of origin is just the starting point. It's not the whole story. It's not even the most important chapter. My relationship with my parents is complicated. We talk, not often, but we talk. There are boundaries now, clear ones, built not from anger, but from self-respect. My mother is learning, slowly and painfully, that the narrative she constructed for 20 years was a fiction. My father is learning that showing up late is still showing up. And Caitlin and I had our first real conversation last month, sitting on Aunt Patricia's porch, drinking tea, saying the things we should have said when we were teenagers, instead of letting a lie metastasize into a 12-year silence. She told me she spent the $800 on a bus ticket to visit a boyfriend in Philadelphia. She said the whole thing started because she was afraid our parents would find out she was dating someone they wouldn't approve of. She said she chose me as the fall person because she knew, with cold, calculated certainty, that our parents would believe her over me. Every time. "That's the part that kills me," she said. "Not that I lied, that I was right. I knew they'd choose me, because they always did." "I know," I said. "That's the part that killed me too." We sat there in the quiet, two sisters who had been shaped by the same broken system, one as the golden child and one as the scapegoat, both damaged, just in different ways. I'm not going to stand here and tell you we're healed. We're not. Healing doesn't work like that. It's not a destination. It's a direction. Some days I wake up and I feel that old tightness in my chest, the feeling of being 9 years old and watching my birthday disappear. Some days I hear my mother's voice in my head saying, "Don't be dramatic." And I have to remind myself that my emotions are valid, that they always were, that the people who told me otherwise were wrong. But most days I wake up next to Daniel and Biscuit is barking because Gloria is calling to ask what I want for Sunday dinner. and my office is full of people who need someone to believe them. And I think this is what it feels like to be chosen, not by obligation, not by guilt, but fully and without conditions. If this story touched you in any way, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Have you ever been the one they chose not to believe? Have you ever had to build your own family from scratch because the one you were born into wasn't safe? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're watching this right now and you're in the middle of your own storm, if you're the one sleeping on the bench or eating Thanksgiving dinner alone, or wondering why your own blood can't see your worth, I want you to hear this. You are not too much. You were never too little. The people who couldn't love you properly were limited by their own damage, and that is their burden, not yours. You don't have to earn belonging. You don't have to perform worthiness. You don't have to shrink yourself to fit in a space that was designed to exclude you. Build your own table. Set your own places. Light your own candles. And trust that the right people will find their way to you. They found me. Sitting in a restaurant in Montclair with a plate of salmon and a question about college. Standing in a fluorescent room with 3 words and a clipboard. Running through a garden with a ring and a ridiculous dog. They'll find you too. That's not hope. That's not wishful thinking. That's architecture. The kind you build with truth and time and the stubborn, beautiful refusal to let anyone else write your story. My name is Natalie Brennan. I'm 28 years old, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.